Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Bobby Fischer and Samuel Reshevsky. This was played in the 1958 USA Championship in New York in the USA, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Fischer on the white end starts by playing the move e4, and we have c5 by Reshevsky, so we get the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, and now d4, so the open Sicilian. And here, Reshevsky decides to play c takes d4, pretty normal, knight takes d4, and g6. So Reshevsky wants to go for the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian. And what he wants to do is place his bishop on g7 and use it to control the long h8, a1 diagonal. And another thing he wants to do is he wants to develop his knight out to f6, bring his bishop out to g7, and simply castle on the king side. Usually when you get this type of position, you always want to think about castling on the king side as opposed to castling on the queen side. So here, Fischer just plays normal development, knight c3, bishop g7, threatening the knight, and Fischer defends the knight with bishop to e3. And now knight to f6. And Reshevsky is now trying to attack the e4 pawn later on in the game. And Fischer plays bishop c4. And this is perhaps what Fischer is most known for in the Sicilian. He plays this variation, which is also known as the Fischer-Sozin attack, because Fischer was the main person who brought this move to fame, and he is the main reason why we call this variation the Fischer-Sozin attack. Now, after bishop c4, we have castles by Reshevsky, and it seems like in this position, Fischer should just castle. And that is correct, but he decides to play the move bishop to b3 because he has a very nice trap in mind. And this was later on named the Bobby Fischer trap because Fischer used it on Samuel Reshevsky. And by the way, Reshevsky is one of the strongest chess prodigies of the 20th century. And he learned to play chess at a very young age, and he was very good at it at that very young age. So here, knight to a5 was played by Reshevsky. And here Fischer plays the move e5. Why did Reshevsky play knight a5 in the beginning? Well, first of all, knight a5 is mainly trying to be played with the idea of taking the bishop on b3, since it's normally a very powerful piece, or it's usually just the piece that has the maximum amount of ability. So what Reshevsky tries to do is target that b3 bishop. So he plays knight a5. However, he should have perhaps played a little bit more calmly and subtly. Instead, a better way to continue would definitely have been something like d6, maybe even going d5 to strike in the center. That would also be completely fine. But what Reshevsky does is a little bit too premature, and it allows Fischer a very nice tactical sequence, which just essentially wins Fischer the game on the spot. So knight to a5, and here the move e5 was played by Fischer. So Fischer attacks the knight on f6, and it forces the knight to go to only one square, and that is e8. You can't go to h5 because there's g4, and that simply traps the knight. So Reshevsky is forced to play the move knight e8. And you might make the argument, why can't Reshevsky just take the bishop on b3? Well, it turns out if this move is actually played, then it ends horribly for Reshevsky, because Fischer can play e takes f6. And now, if you look at this position, Fischer is attacking both the bishop on g7 and the knight on b3. And the normal move to be played here would be knight takes a1, simply grabbing as much material as you possibly can. But after f takes g7, the position just becomes very unclear for Reshevsky. Here, your knight is attacked, but also your rook on f8 is attacked as well. So let's say you play the move knight takes c2 check. This grabs the most amount of material possible. Knight takes c2. Now after king takes g7, yes, okay, maybe the position is slightly better for Reshevsky because he might have slightly more material, but that's not the point, and the point is that Fischer has a lot more piece activity. For instance, he could develop his queen out to d4, get a very nice centralized queen, maybe even to d2 and threaten moves like bishop to h6, which could simply win this rook on f8 and win the exchange back. And if you look at Reshevsky's pieces, they're hardly developed, and you can already see why Reshevsky didn't want to go into a variation which gives him a terrible position. So he doesn't take the bishop, he instead plays the move knight to e8, which is the only good move here. But here, this is where Fischer's famous trap comes into play, and I encourage you to pause the video and try finding out how Fischer simply crushed Reshevsky from here on out. Okay, so Fischer played the move bishop takes f7 check, and it's a very brilliant move, because first of all, you're checking the king, and you just captured a pawn, and it seems like it's a very terrible move, because you just sacrificed the bishop for a pawn, and it doesn't seem like you have anything for the material. But in fact you do, and in fact you actually gain more material than you lose. So here, there are two options. You can either capture with the rook, or you could capture with the king. You could even think about king h8, but that also leads to a similar variation. So if you capture with the rook, now here the move that Fischer can play is knight to e6. And he plays this move because he knows that now your queen is attacked. If you take the knight with the pawn, then you lose your queen, and then also both of your knights are being forked from the queen on d8. But not only that, the queen cannot move anywhere that saves herself. So you can't go to c7 because of the knight, you can't go to b6 because of this bishop, and Reshevsky's queen is simply powerless against the impending danger that is happening right now. So this would be a strong and severe threat. Perhaps best would be d takes e6, and now after you take the queen, there's knight c6. And now if you take the knight on e8, then there's rook f8 from Reshevsky, so he might still have chances of surviving since your queen is trapped. But the thing is, Fischer doesn't have to take the knight, and he could just move his queen back somewhere to d2. And Fischer is definitely better here because he has more material and he has more piece activity. So that would be rook f7, and although you could go king h8, this would allow knight e6 as well. And now you're simply lost, because if you take the knight, then you lose your queen. It's just as bad, essentially. And the final move is king takes f7, which was played in the game. But if king takes f7 is played, what do you think Fischer is going to play in this position? Well, it turns out he's going to stay with his idea. Knight to e6. And would you look at that? The queen is attacked. You can't take with the pawn because then obviously you lose your queen and it's undefended, because this knight nicely disconnects this rook's defense to the queen, and vice versa. And after this knight e6 move is played, Reshevsky is given into question, how are you going to respond? Do you want to keep your queen by playing king takes e6, or do you want to sacrifice it and at least not get checkmated right away? And Reshevsky decides to play the move d takes e6, and he wants to keep his king alive for a bit longer. Why do you not play king takes e6 and just grab the knight, which was troubling your queen? Well, it turns out this would actually lead to a mate in 6, and this is the reason why the trap is so lethal and it's so powerful in this position. Queen to d5 check. Where can the king move? It can't go to f7, which it would want to go to, and it can't go to f6, so it must go to f5. But now, how do you continue? You play g4 check. You expose the king's position. The king is wide open. You don't need to play a passive game where you slowly but surely build up an attack. No. You have to go straight for the king's heart, because the king is completely exposed and it has nowhere to hide. And here the only place to go to is to capture the pawn on g4, and now the other pieces start to come into the position. Rook g1 check. And now you could go to h3, you could go to h5, you could go to h4, and you could even go to f5. So among these few squares that you can go to, where are you actually going to move between all of these options? Well, let's see. If you go to h4, h5, or h3, regardless of which square on the h file you move to, you are already in danger. Because if you go here, for instance, then Fischer does not have to play a checking move. He does not have to be violent in this position. He can just simply play a quiet queen g2. And the threat is indeed stronger than the execution in this position, because there's no way to stop queen g5 check, queen g4 mate, and even ideas like checking and then bringing the queen to the other side and having a double major piece mate, where you simply are just cutting the king off from going anywhere. So after rook g1 check, you cannot play the king to the h file, and it doesn't matter if you go to h3 or h5, any square on the h file is already a death sentence for your king. So instead, king to f5 could also be considered, but that leads to an immediate checkmate with rook to g5. This is even worse than going to the h file, but still, either case is going to be a bad position for black, and it's going to end up in checkmate. So you cannot take the knight on e6 with the king, and thus you have to capture it with the pawn, which is a very painful thing to do, considering that you have to give up your queen, and there's really nothing that Hrushevsky can do here. Knight c6, he attacks the queen retreats all the way back to d2, and now bishop takes e5. And here's the problem. You don't have enough compensation for the queen. You have only a bishop and a knight, and the pawns are equal. So you have no pawns as compensation. You simply only have 2 pieces against the queen, which is a very hard position to play, and you have to give Hrushevsky credit for at least holding on for a bit longer. Castles, knight d6, and what Hrushevsky wants to do is simply play knight c4 and get rid of the powerful bishop that is on e3. The bishop goes to f4, and knight c4 nonetheless. Queen to e2, and now Fischer is not targeting the bishop on e5, he's targeting the knight on c4. And that is exactly what happens. So we have a trade, and king to g7. So Hrushevsky defends the bishop, knight to e4, and Fischer wants to infiltrate. He's soon going to bring his rooks onto the d-file, most likely double both of them on the d-file, and they are going to be very potent attackers. The bishop retreats back to c7, knight c5. What is Fischer threatening? Well, he's threatening to capture the e6 pawn and gain an extra pawn. Rook f6, defending, c3. It's such a painful position to play here when you have absolutely no material to fight back against your enemy's forces. So e5, rook a d1, and now knight to d8. The knight goes into d7, and now you must play rook c6 if you do not want to give up material. Why? Because your bishop is being attacked by this queen. Okay, so the bishop is hit, and so is the rook on f6 from your knight. And even though you could play bishop takes d7, queen takes d7 is very powerful since you're attacking the knight once the bishop moves, but you're also attacking the bishop, so the bishop is kind of forced to move from this double attack. So after this knight d7 move, rook c6 forced, and queen to h4. Now there's a threat on the e7 pawn. The rook goes to e6. It's so hard to defend when not all of your pieces are developed. I mean, look at this bishop, look at this knight, and then look at this rook. They are terribly placed. They haven't even moved that much in the game. Knight c5, Fischer gains a tempo. And now the rook must go to s6 if it wants to preserve the e7 pawn. After rook f6, knight e4, Hrushevsky knows that if he plays rook to f7 or to e6, then there is knight g5. It doesn't matter where you go with the rook, knight g5 will be the follow-up. And that's simply it, if you did that. So rook f4, he had to give up the pawn on e7. He goes back. The queen goes to a3. Why does the queen not go to h4? Well, most likely because the rook would go back to f4, and then there would be a repeat of the position. So queen to a3. The knight comes out to c6. The knight comes to d6. The bishop takes, and now the rook takes. The bishop gets out to f5. So Hrushevsky has developed all of his pieces, but it's too late now. Because after b4, rook ff8, b5, the knight's kicked back. And now rook to d5. A better approach, I think, that Fischer could have tried was actually just to move this rook over to d1, and it creates a very nice threat. Because if Hrushevsky plays something like h6, for instance, then Fischer can easily capitalize on the position by going rook takes d8. And after rook takes d8, you can interpose this check on e7 right away. You could even just capture the rook, and after rook takes d8, queen e7 check. Either way, you lose the rook, and it's queen versus bishop, an easy win for Fischer. So, rook to d5, that's not bad, but I just think rook fd1 would have been better. Knight f7, Reshevsky develops, and now comes rook c5. So Fischer's idea is to transfer the rook over to the 7th rank via this way, since the bishop on f5 is guarding the d7 square. a6, and now before doing anything like rook c7 infiltrating on the 7th rank, Fischer simply plays b6. He doesn't want any tension between the pawns, and he doesn't want the rook to get active. For instance, if he takes, then the rook gets the open a file. It's not going to be a very powerful attack, but later on in the game it could eventually be beneficial for Reshevsky. So bishop e4, what does Reshevsky want to do? Well, he wants to play the move bishop c6 and simply solidify the position. Make sure that this rook has no entry points. However, Fischer is not worried about that rook having entry points. He is worried about a solid bishop holding down this entire position. So what would you do naturally in a position like this? Well, you would sacrifice. You would play rook c6, give up the exchange, but it's completely worth it, because how are you going to patch up that hole that Fischer just created? After bc6, b7, and not only did he do this just to split the pawns and just to make the pawns isolated, no, he also did this to create a passed pawn. And right now, if you play the move rook a7, you're already lost after queen takes f8 check. And after king takes f8, b8 queen, that's it. Reshevsky has nothing else to do. So you must go rook a b8, but now simply Fischer just grabs all the pawns that were lying there. Knight d8, rook b1. He defends the b7 pawn. The rook goes to f7, and now h3. You don't want to get back rank checkmated, so just play a prophylactic move. Rook f takes b7, we have a trade, and now queen to a8. And after this move was played, Samuel Reshevsky resigned the game. He resigned because, yes, you can defend the knight. You could do it by either interposing a check and then going rook d1, or you could just immediately defend with rook d7. But regardless of what you do, the plan is simple for Fischer. He's just going to go a4, push the pawn up the board, eventually move his queen out of the way, and he might queen himself. And you essentially have to give up so much material just to stop that one pawn from queening, and this was just too much for Reshevsky to handle, being down so much material. That's why after this a4 move was played, Reshevsky resigned the game, in a very brilliant victory for Bobby Fischer, who, by the way, was only 15 years old when this game was played, and he had the creative mind of a genius. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.